Hello and welcome to this special edition of the debate on France24. I'm Andrea Sanke in Paris, and we've just been watching French President Nicolas Sarkozy address reporters there following his first speech in his role as French president to the UN General Assembly earlier today. Tonight we'll be debating not just what was in that speech, but what we heard at that press conference as well. And joining me in the studio for the debate, to my left, Robert Parsons, France24's chief international correspondent, and to my right, Jolyon Howorth, professor of political science from Yale University. So first things first, actually, we already did do a rather extensive discussion on Sarkozy's UN speech a little earlier, so let's look at what he said at the top of this press conference here. One of the first things he addressed, and I also think it's fair to mention that the speech was far more concise than the press conference, so we're going to give it as much coherence as we can here in the debate. First things first, in the press conference, talked about reforming the UN Security Council and the United Nations in general, whereby he says France has introduced a lot of common sense. In what respect, Jolyon?
Well, what France has done has been to draw attention to the fact that all of these brilliant ideas for the reform of the United Nations Security Council, which have been around for a long time, are good ideas. I think this is what he means by common sense. I mean, nobody has a miracle solution to the reform of the Security Council, but everybody has the same solution. We have to have India, Brazil, we have to have Germany, Japan, we have to have a representative of the African countries, we have to have a Middle East representative. You know, there's no mystery about any of this. So I don't actually think that what France has done, other than to say this is terribly important, we support it and we're going to give it a lot of political backing, particularly during the French presidency of the United Nations. That's about it, really.
But Sarkozy would like to take a little more credit for it, then.
Well, Sarkozy likes to take credit in many ways, and I certainly don't think that there is anything new that France has put on the table, as far as I'm aware, beyond ideas that have been around now for quite a long time.
Okay.
Well, what he has done, I suppose, you could say, is that he's injecting energy into the debate, which has been absent. And as Julian was saying, there's nothing new about the ideas that we heard from Sarkozy, but the debate has been rather flat, and he does bring a lot of energy to whatever forum he is working with, and certainly that was the case today. We heard it in the speech. He brought passion to the discussion. If you contrasted it, for instance, with the speech of George W. Bush, which was rather flat, his was full of energy and passion. He makes you sit up and listen, and maybe that's a good thing.
I think you could add probably that he is sincere. I always hesitate to suggest that a leading politician is sincere, but I do believe that he is sincere in believing that the international community cannot continue without fully bringing on board the major players, all of the major players. And his support for these reforms of the United Nations Security Council are complemented by his own proposals for the reform of the G8, because in his speech, actually during his campaign speech and in the speech to the ambassadors in the middle of August, he made it clear that the G8 also must be expanded to bring in China, India, Brazil, and similar representatives of the world's global players. I think he genuinely does believe that without that sort of multilateral international framework, we are going to get a divided world, problems are not going to get resolved. And to that extent, I would agree entirely that
that puts him at odds too with the United States, of course, which insists on a unipolar world, whereas the sort of world that Nicolas Sarkozy is talking about involves multiple points of reference. And although he says he's a friend of the United States, he's made it also clear to the United States, both in his speech and I think in the press conference there as well, that friends are there to give you good advice as well, not just to listen to you.
What better person to push for this multipolar platform than Sarkozy, who's now the leader that the United States sees as a close friend?
He's in a good position at the moment, and I think he's manoeuvred himself very skillfully into that position as well.
Let's look then at, towards the end, but had more to do with what was being addressed actually at the beginning. One of the reporters asked, what will be your first action as chairman of the Security Council? He gave a bit of a scattered answer, but most are expecting that Darfur and French troops being involved in Chad and the Central African Republic to prevent the spillover from the Darfur conflict will be first on the agenda at the Security Council. where can we expect the French to go from there?
Well, I don't think there are going to be French troops as such. What is being prepared is a European Union mission, which will have a lot of French troops in it. And the sorts of size of forces we're talking about going into Chad are as many as 5, 6, possibly even 7,000 troops. And the EU has not sent in that sort of a force other than to Kosovo, other than to Bosnia, under the current operation. I think that we have to see this in perspective. This is not going to bring peace to Darfur. What this operation is all about is actually protecting refugee camps where 2.5 million people have been displaced from Darfur into Chad. So it's essentially a humanitarian operation which doesn't have any real bearing on the peace negotiations other than to facilitate the involvement of Chad as a neighbouring frontline state in the overall negotiations that are taking place. And those negotiations have now been more or less taken over, as I understand it, by Libya. Under Colonel Gaddafi, there's going to be a conference in Tripoli at the end of October. The signs actually, the tea leaves at the moment, are looking relatively positive, at least more positive than they have for a very long time. Because many of these rebel leaders have agreed to go to Tripoli. We now have an African process. African ownership was always a very important part of this. And I guess the Chinese also have realized that it's in their interest to stabilize a part of the world that they are heavily investing in. So there are a number of pieces of the jigsaw that are coming together to give some modest grounds for hope. I think, if I can just add one small point, the biggest problem is that there are now as many as 20 different rebel groups in Darfur who are resisting the central government in Khartoum, and many of them are just totally unrealistic about what is involved in negotiations at an international level, what the stakes are, what they could possibly get out of this process at the end of the day. And that, I think, ultimately will be the acid test of whether this can go forward. If some of these groups remain on these extremist positions that they've been, and we should never forget that civil wars are very difficult to end, then it might not be as easy as that.
Well, just to follow on with what Jolyon was saying, I think Sarkozy said in the New York Times, I think it was on Monday, that the idea was not that the French should lead this force. In fact, he said it would be preferable if some other country led the force. France would obviously contribute troops, but the main thing was to prevent. He said there's no point in solving the problem in Darfur if by doing that you're only displacing the problem from Sudan to Chad or to the Central African Republic. So that is the point of having those troops on the border to prevent that happening.
Okay. Moving on then, Robert, I'll start with you here. What did you make of his response on where France stands and what it can do as far as conflict in Lebanon is concerned? Well,
I mean, he was asked a question in the context of today's debate in the Lebanese parliament. There's a special session of the parliament to elect a new president to replace Michael Lahoud, who steps down in November. There wasn't a forum, so it didn't happen. Lebanon seems to be moving from crisis to crisis. What he said was that France was committed to preventing that happening. France was determined to help the present government in Lebanon, but France also wanted to support all sides in the equation in Lebanon. In other words, he didn't want to be associated too closely with the present government. He wanted to make absolutely clear that France wanted two things: that all parties to the equation in Lebanon should be taken into account, but there should be no outside interference either, and that the policy of assassination of members of parliament to whittle down majorities was simply not acceptable.
Jolyon.
Yeah, I think that's right. His main concern, I think, is to keep Syria out of the whole process, and on that, France has been absolutely on the same page with the United States now for 3 or 4 years on the Lebanon thing. Lebanon has this tradition of balancing its different religious communities in the main positions of the state. And what Sarkozy is saying is that we want to try to continue with that and make sure that nobody is kind of eliminating others. Quite how France can help to deliver that in practical political terms isn't at all clear, even though Kushner himself has organized a conference here in Paris of all the Lebanese leaders in an attempt to sort of try to get them to talk it all through. But what we saw today is that large numbers of them are not even prepared to go through with the process and form a quorum in the parliament in order to elect a president. How that's likely to change over the next month, because we've only got 1 month, isn't at all clear. But I think he's saying that France will, use all its influence within the international community, hand in hand with the United States and the European Union, to do what it can.
It's a difficult problem as well, because France wants to be seen to be helping Lebanon, to be helping the present government. Right. But if it appears to be helping the present government too closely, the accusation will be made from the opposition that it's partial, right, which was the problem under Chirac's administration. Right. That France became, or President Chirac came to be seen by the opposition, by Hezbollah in particular, as being too supportive of the government. France's role was criticised as being one-sided. That's the dilemma that Sarkozy somehow has to wriggle out of. And we saw the invitation earlier in the summer by Bernard Kushner to all the parties in the Lebanese dispute to France to discuss the issue. That was an attempt, I suppose, to start to convince people. But as Jolyon was saying, it's going to be rather more difficult than that.
Mm-hmm. If you had one final comment, go ahead.
Yeah, no, again, and it's always the same, not just with Sarkozy, but the reality is that none of these issues can be solved on its own. I mean, they're all interlinked. Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran. These are multiple crises in the Middle East which feed into one another. So, again, I think what he's saying is that we have to tackle this in a holistic and global perspective.
Okay. Now, an observation several people made over the course of this press conference is that many of these questions, including perhaps the Lebanon question, would have been better directed to Foreign Minister Bernard Kushner, since he is in fact the one hosting this conference that you referred to. Yet he sat very quietly on the sidelines the entire time until one reporter addressed him directly, in which he only gave perhaps a 30-second answer to not the most relevant question, I might say. What do we see at play here, if anything? Perhaps we're making too much of this, but it was interesting to observe a foreign minister entirely on the sidelines throughout this whole conference.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think it was very interesting. He looked sort of slightly uncomfortable there. I think he was saying, on the one hand, he was saying, look, I'm the boss, I think. I'm the president. But also, it was interesting, too, that he went out of his way at the same time to praise Bernard Kushner on, I think, about 6 occasions, which is slightly strange as well. It was as if to sort of reassure him, don't worry, I'm not letting you have a word, but I think you're a very good guy. But don't say anything. Just sit there and don't say anything, and I'll be nice to you. But, the background to it, I think, perhaps is this recent disagreement or divergence of views between the two over Iran, whereas Bernard Kushner was much more outspoken on Iran and mentions that war is a possibility if all other options are exhausted. Sarkozy said quite explicitly just a couple of days ago that war is not a word he uses. So there was clearly a difference between the two on that. I think a degree of irritation on the part of the presidency about the direction that Kushner had taken the debate in.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Jolyon.
Yeah, I mean, 2 things. First of all, on that, we actually did have a debate on this program last week about the Sarkozy, about the Kushner bombshell. Yeah. And I recall then we were saying, we need to actually look more closely at what Kushner actually said. And what he said was pretty indistinguishable from what Sarkozy himself said in the speech to the ambassadors.
It was a formulation of words.
Well, they're making the point that we must avoid at all cost being put in a position where we have to choose between an Iranian bomb and the bombing of Iran. That was the formula that Sarkozy used. Kushner said something very similar. It went down very badly, and they've then retracted collectively, I think. I'm not sure that they're necessarily... I think they were probably trying this, see how it went down. Okay. Anyway, on the substantive issue of the sort of hierarchical position between the president and the...
I'm going to let you get back to that because we're over time now. We just have to take a 12-minute break now for news and weather, but we will return with this discussion after that. Do stay with us. Welcome back to the special edition of the debate on France24, where we have been discussing the appearance, the first address actually, of French President Nicolas Sarkozy to the UN General Assembly in New York. Following that address, he also held a press conference where he fielded a wide variety of questions from a huge number of reporters actually in attendance. So we're going to be looking at both those, the press conference as well as the speech that he doled out at the UN General Assembly. Let's start, though, with what we saw latest in the press conference, when we all noticed that considerable time was spent on one issue in particular that seems to be of considerable importance in France. He was asked about France's response to Colombia's hostage crisis. There is a genuine interest in securing the release of the former Colombian presidential candidate, Franco-Colombian Ingrid Betancourt. In his response to that, he said that France invites Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez to enter the forum if he has something of value to add. And he said personally, Hugo Chavez would be invited to France. What can be made of that, Robert?
Well, again, I think that comes within the context of France having friends, but having friends, and friends in this case the United States, which can't dictate to you what you do or who you talk to. And I think the point that Sarkozy is trying to make is that although France will be a loyal friend to the United States, it does have interests of its own as well. And sometimes there will be differences between the two, but the United States should not see the French decision to invite Hugo Chavez to France as in some way directed against the United States or in some way negative. France has its own policies to pursue as well. In addition to that, of course, there is the whole issue of Betancourt, and he wants to pursue every possible avenue. And if Hugo Chavez can, in some way, facilitate the release of Ms. Betancourt, then of course it's something that France will be interested in.
Mm-hmm. Let me turn our attention now to New York, because joining us is our own correspondent, Philippe Bolopion, via satellite. There he is. Philippe, expand, if you will. And first of all, I think you can better explain why there is so much interest in France for the French government to be involved in this Colombian hostage crisis. So much so that Sarkozy, as we saw, spent very considerable amount of time in this press conference talking specifically about that issue.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's, Ingrid Betancourt is a very well-known face in France, and people have been following what's happening to her for years now. And even her family is very well-known. They are very public characters. And it seems also that, President Sarkozy has made a priority of solving this kind of crisis, first in Libya, and now he has really set his view on trying to gain the release of Ingrid Betancourt, and he's probably not going to stop until that happens. So that's why he's inviting Hugo Chavez, which is a pretty controversial move if you consider how Chavez is perceived in the US. Don't forget that last year Hugo Chavez was in the very General Assembly where Mr. Sarkozy gave his speech today, and he was calling George Bush a devil. He was mocking him, he was taunting him, he was saying that it was smelling like sulfur after his speech. So it's not. It shows that France is really going to go a long way to try to gain that release.
And now, is he only engaging Chavez because of his interest in the Colombian hostage crisis, or is Sarkozy feel comfortable engaging Chavez on a number of international issues?
Well, probably. What Nicolas Sarkozy is saying pretty much is, we have some strong values. We know who we are, but at the same time, because we have these values, we can talk to anyone. We are able to reach to anyone. Today, the French Foreign Affairs Minister, Bernard Kushner, is going to talk with his counterpart, his Iranian counterpart. So, to them, there is no taboo there in who you are talking to. The issue is more what you're saying to them, what you are asking from them, and how you deal with them.
Okay. Jolyon.
On the Betancourt issue, I think that this goes back a long way. French hostages who are taken are very much the centre of public attention, and there's a lot of political clout to be derived from their release. We saw this in the 1980s, where there was a lot of political tussle between Mitterrand and Chirac over the release of hostages in Lebanon. I'm not saying for one moment that Sarkozy is doing this for political reasons, but there is a lot politically at stake in this release, and I think that he can show, if he can actually pull it off and demonstrate that he succeeded where other regimes in the past have failed, then he gets a lot out of that. Talking to Chavez is just something that Sarkozy would naturally do. I think his whole approach here is to involve all the players in the game and talk to everybody, because there is something to be talked about.
Okay, let's. Interesting too, as you mentioned that in the 1990s in Kosovo, when the two French pilots were held hostage there, that's when France. Another time we saw that what you were just explaining. And on the issue of Kosovo, which was brought up again in this press conference, Sarkozy responded to a question on the independence of Kosovo, saying it is unavoidable. It is a European issue. No one wants to humiliate Russia, however. That's a delicate balance, saying independence for Kosovo is unavoidable, knowing Russia will stop at any cost, will try and stop that. So how does Sarkozy manage that?
Well, with great difficulty, I would say. I mean, at the G8 summit earlier this year, he had an attempt at persuading Vladimir Putin that they should put the whole debate on hold for 6 months so that everybody could get round the table together and try and find some way out of the crisis. Putin wasn't interested, bluntly. And the French initiative was allowed to sort of run into the sand. The problem is going to remain. It's all very well for Sarkozy to say, it's inevitable that it's going to happen, but it's also inevitable, as you were just suggesting, that Russia is going to oppose it. The Russians have been absolutely clear that unless Serbia gives the go-ahead to Kosovan independence, Russia will not support the idea. Mm-hmm. Clearly, Serbia is not going to, under present circumstances at least anyway, is not going to accept the idea of Kosovo independence. So we're heading towards a clash of some kind. And that could be extremely divisive for Europe. And this is something that Sarkozy is clearly wanting to avoid. There could be serious political divisions within Europe over the issue of Kosovo. And that would, from his point of view, be a really bad step backwards.
Right. Go ahead, Jolyon.
I think where we are now is that we've had this crisis for 10 years, nearly. We've had a long period during which the Ahtisaari plan was put forward. The negotiations with all the parties took place. Everybody agrees that this is the only real plan that can work. However, the Russians don't like it, and a number of European countries are stalling on it. Basically, all EU member states now are faced with this reality. Kosovo is almost certain to declare independence later this year. At which point the United States will recognize Kosovo, and the European Union has now come up with a statement that it too will collectively recognize. The big issue, and this is what Sarkozy is playing for, big time, is to ensure that all 27 member states go along with that. That's actually very unlikely to happen. There are a number of states that are very worried about it. The Russian thing I actually don't think is a major issue. This is not high stakes for Russia, Kosovo. It's very symbolic. It's very symbolic. There's absolutely no reason why Russia should play ace cards with Kosovo. Missile defense is much more important for them. They're, in a sense, playing games with Kosovo. And I think that from the Russian perspective, while they're not going to go along with it in the United Nations, I think it's nevertheless negotiable. It's a question of what the price is. Nobody yet knows what the price is because I haven't asked. But I think there would be potentially a price for Russian recognition.
I think perhaps too that the Russians do recognise that it is inevitable, that it will somewhere down the road it's going to happen, and perhaps as a consequence of that they're trying to eke as much political capital out of it as possible. Exactly. And they're trying to link the whole thing too to the disputed territories in the former Soviet Union, particularly two territories in Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and Transnistria in Moldova. There's the argument being that if it happens with Kosovo, then inevitably, the same applies to Transnistria.
Let me ask Philippe briefly, how strong a lead do you expect Sarkozy and France to take on the issue of Kosovo? I'm being told now we've lost that satellite feed, so go ahead, Jolyon. You had a comment?
Well, I think they will take a very strong lead, and the difficulty will be not... there are a number of countries in Europe that Russia has played on because they have similar separatist problems. Hungary, Slovakia, even Spain at one point. Now, Spain is not resisting going through with this because of fears about the Basque country or Catalonia. Spain takes a much more realistic perspective that this is not something we should do in a hurry if the parties are not agreed on it and if the international community isn't agreed on it. However, some of these other countries in the European Union which do have potentially separatist situations are concerned that Kosovo will be a pretext for further developments. And Russia, with the South Ossetia thing and the Abkhazia thing and the Transnistria thing, is playing on those fears. So I think that the French and the British and the Germans here collectively will play a very strong role in trying to ensure that we've got European unity. Bernard Kushner and the British Foreign Secretary Miliband recently wrote a joint letter to the European press saying we have to hang together on this. It is very, very important.
And they've also been stressing quite firmly as well that Kosovo is not a precedent for anywhere else, that these things are quite separate. Each issue has to be taken on its own merits.
Well, they would say that, wouldn't they?
Okay, let's turn back now to Sarkozy's address to the UN General Assembly. And we have a soundbite now of one of the key points he made. See if we can get that to play. Talking about there will be no peace in the world, he stressed. And in this, you will hear he makes a very interesting point on Iran actually having the right to nuclear power, but then not the right to...
There will be no peace in the world if the international community falters in the face of the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Iran is entitled to nuclear power for civilian purposes, but in allowing Iran to acquire nuclear weapons, we would run an unacceptable risk to the stability of the region and of the world. I want to say in the name of France that this crisis will only be resolved if both firmness and dialogue are employed together.
Was that well phrased, Robert?
Well, I mean, it's what we had expected to hear from Nicolas Sarkozy. It's what France has been saying for a long time now. So, I mean, in his terms, certainly, I think it was well phrased. You know, France is saying and has been saying Iran is entitled to nuclear technology, as is everybody else. The question, of course, is when they start enriching uranium, and the risk arises that they may perfect the process to the extent that they can start developing their own nuclear weapons. And that's the unacceptable risk that he's not prepared to accept, and for some time has been saying as much. He repeated today what he's been saying for some time.
Jolyon.
Yeah, I think there are two issues there. The issue of the distinction between civilian nuclear power and the military power is at the heart of this whole discussion. Part of the problem, in a sense, has been that the negotiations between the European Union and Iran over the last 3 years have actually had as their bottom line that Iran should not have civilian nuclear power. And that was an issue in the French presidential campaign. Sarkozy is strictly correct in saying there is nothing under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Indeed, the Non-Proliferation Treaty says quite explicitly that Iran can have this. So that's a sort of a grey area. I think the other issue, though, is proliferation in general. I mean, we've only had 3 proliferators since the 5 recognized nuclear powers in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and all 3 of them have done it surreptitiously. India, Pakistan, and of course Israel, which is technically not. What we're seeing now is countries trying to prepare themselves openly to become nuclear powers, and the international community, with France very much playing a leading role here, is trying to do everything it can to ensure that doesn't happen. Because if it does happen, then really the Non-Proliferation Treaty is dead and we are into a very serious new era. However, there are many who say we can all live with, as we live with a Pakistani bomb, we can live with an Iranian bomb. They can be deterred. These are states, these are not terrorists.
Right.
And deterrence works. That's a big debate in international relations.
Precisely. The temptation, assuming Iran were to acquire a nuclear bomb, the temptation for it to use a nuclear weapon would have to be balanced against the entirely plausible risk that there would be a massive response from the United States and Israel as well.
I think the biggest problem with the Iranian bomb is that it would inevitably lead to other proliferators in the Middle East. There's no way that that could be avoided. Yeah.
Quickly then, the core really of his speech, I feel, was this labeling of a new world order in which he would like France to be a leader in going into the 21st century, building a new world order. It was a theme he repeated several times in his speech to the UN General Assembly. Jolyon, you define what a new world order is for Sarkozy.
Well, I think it's the world order, actually, that France has been talking about for the last 15, 20 years, since, in fact, George H.W. Bush, Bush's father, used the expression first in 1990. It's a multipolar world. And to say that the world is being structured by an ever smaller number of ever larger units isn't particularly provocative or even extraordinary. It's a fact. It flies in the face of another interpretation of the world as a unipolar world dominated by one hyperpower with everybody else sort of underneath, which, has come up against reality in certain parts of the world in the last 5 years. So I think that that's his view. France will play an important part in Europe, but he would like to see a world in which 7 or 8 major poles are recognized and can talk to one another.
Okay. Jolyon, on that, we're going to have to leave it there. Robert, I apologize for not getting you a last word. But we are completely out of time for this special edition of the debate, so I'd like to thank our panel for joining us. Jolyon Howorth, Professor of Political Science from Yale University, and, of course, Robert Parsons, International Affairs Editor here at France24. Thanks to our audience for joining us as well. That is all for tonight. Another edition tomorrow. Bonsoir.